Some people think the worst betrayals come from strangers. But the truth is, the deepest wounds are carved by family. When my sister stole my entire $150,000 inheritance by forging our dying father's will, I nearly gave up. But then my lawyer found a video, a security camera clip that showed her guiding our sedated father's hand as she whispered, "Just sign here, Dad." That footage didn't just expose her crime, it made her utter 4 words that still echo in my head, and I'll never forget them. My name is Marcus Cole. I'm a 41-year-old electrician from Tulsa, and until 6 months ago, I believed my older sister Janine was the one person I could trust with anything. We buried our father after a brutal cancer fight, and the day after the funeral, she produced a handwritten will that left her everything, a flawless document, signed and notarized, that stripped me of the $150,000 inheritance our dad had always promised to split evenly. I was drowning in grief, but something about that will felt off. The signature was too neat. The timing was too convenient, so I made one call that would unravel a secret I never imagined possible. And what my lawyer found sitting on a tiny security camera in my father's den would destroy the one thing Janine was still counting on: my silence. To understand how I ended up sitting across a conference table watching a security video that would send my own sister to prison, you have to understand who my father was first. Harold Cole was not a wealthy man by any stretch. He drove the same Ford pickup for 20 years, patched the knees of his work pants himself, and saved every dollar he could from 47 years as a maintenance supervisor at a public school district. That $150,000 represented an entire lifetime of skipped vacations and brown bag lunches. When my mother passed in 2008, Dad told me and Janine, separately and together on at least a dozen occasions, that his will split everything right down the middle. He said it smiling, as if the fairness of it was the one thing he could still control in a world that had already taken his wife. Janine was always the golden child. Older than me by 3 years, she had the charm, the perfect grades, the ability to walk into any room and immediately know which person mattered most and how to stand next to them. I was never jealous of that. That was just Janine being Janine. I loved her for it. She handled Dad's doctor appointments during his illness, arranged the home care nurses, managed the medication schedule. She framed herself as the responsible one, the one holding everything together. In hindsight, that gave her near total access to every piece of paper, every signed document, every medication log that would later become the exact evidence needed to manipulate a dying man's final signature. My father was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer in April of last year. The decline was fast and punishing. By early October, he could barely speak above a whisper, and the morphine kept him drifting in and out of a fog that was somewhere between sleep and absence. I installed a small motion-activated camera in the corner of his den, pointed at his recliner. I told Janine about it at the time. It was for safety. Dad had fallen twice, and the nurses could not be there every minute. She said she understood completely. She even helped me angle it so it covered the entire seating area and the small writing desk beside it. I did not think twice about that offer until 6 months later, when my lawyer asked a question that made my blood stop moving. The morning Dad died, Janine called me at work, already sobbing. I drove straight to the house. She was in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee and looking more composed than any grieving daughter had a right to look. But grief is strange, and I gave her the benefit of every doubt. 2 days after the funeral, she invited me over to go through some papers. That was when she pulled a document from a manila envelope and slid it across the kitchen table. A handwritten will, dated 3 weeks before Dad's death. Signed, she said, in front of a mobile notary she had arranged to come to the house. The signature looked like Dad's. The notary stamp was authentic, and every single cent was left to Janine. She told me Dad had decided I did not need the money as much as she did. She looked me in the eyes and said she was sorry, but that she had to honor his final wishes. I walked out of that house, feeling like I had been hollowed out with a spoon. The grief of losing my father was already crushing, but this was a different kind of pain. It was the pain of being erased by the one person who was supposed to share the loss with me. For 2 weeks, I did nothing. I told myself there was nothing I could do. The will looked airtight. The notary was real. The signature matched the dozen examples I had saved in old birthday cards. But then, late one night, I remembered something Janine had mentioned months earlier, almost as an aside, about faxing some documents from her office the morning Dad had slipped into a deep morphine sleep for the last time. She said it so casually, I had not registered it as significant. But the timeline nagged at me. I hired a probate attorney named Dennis Morrow. Dennis was a former fraud prosecutor for the state of Oklahoma, someone who had spent 20 years looking at documents other people believed were perfect and finding the single thread that unraveled everything. He took one look at the will and told me he had seen cleaner forgeries from people with far less to gain. He started by pulling phone records, email logs, and fax transmission histories from Janine's employer. What he found made the first real crack in the case. On the morning of October 22nd, 4 hours after my father had received his final morphine dose and been declared non-responsive by the hospice nurse, Janine faxed a set of will pages from her office to herself. The transmission log recorded the exact time. She had scanned amended pages, altering the original document that had split the estate equally. And then she had gone straight to my father's house with the notary already waiting. The notary later testified she had no idea the man in the recliner was barely conscious. He grunted when she asked if he understood. Janine had said he was just tired. Dennis did not stop there. He asked if there were any cameras in the house. I remembered the security camera in the den. I had forgotten to mention it. He requested every video file from the week of the supposed signing. I brought him the hard drive, and we sat in his office, watching footage in silence. For the first several days, it was just Dad sleeping, nurses coming and going, Janine visiting with soup, and her phone pressed to her ear. But then, we reached October 22nd. The timestamp on the corner of the screen read 11:47 in the morning. My father was slumped in his recliner, eyes half closed, mumbling words that made no sense. Janine walked in with a blank sheet of paper and a pen. She knelt beside him, placed the paper on the armrest, and wrapped his fingers around the pen with her own hand. She moved his hand for him, guiding the strokes while he whispered, "Too tired. Can't. Too tired." She shushed him softly, said, "Just this one thing, Dad, and then you can rest." She never mentioned a notary in the video, but we saw her take the signed blank page, the signature she would later fill in with the new will language above it, and fold it carefully into her bag. The video proved the signature was obtained when he had no capacity to consent. But here is the detail that shattered everything. The morphine log confirmed the dose was administered at 7:30 that morning, exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes before Janine placed the pen in his hand. Medical experts would later testify that, at that level of sedation, Harold Cole could not have formed the intent to sign a birthday card, let alone a legal document disinheriting his son. Dennis had the evidence. He called Janine's attorney and scheduled a deposition, with the video loaded and ready to play. Janine arrived in a dark blazer, confident, smiling at me across the table like I was still the little brother who could be managed with a few soft words. Dennis asked her a series of routine questions about the will. She answered perfectly. Then he pushed a laptop toward her and pressed play. And for the first time in her life, Janine Cole watched herself commit a felony on camera in front of a court reporter, a prosecutor, and the brother she had betrayed. The color drained from her face. Her perfectly rehearsed composure cracked right down the middle. She stared at the screen, watching her own hand guide our father's hand across a page that would become the cornerstone of her lie. Dennis paused the video and looked at her expectantly. Janine opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. And the 4 words that came out of her next are the reason this case is still discussed in probate court hallways to this day. I didn't think he'd actually die. The words hung in the air like smoke, and no one in that conference room moved. The court reporter's hands stopped over her keys. Dennis Morrow set down his pen slowly, the way you set down something fragile. Janine froze the instant she heard her own voice, as if she had spoken to someone else and only now realized the words had come from her lips. She looked at me. For a single heartbeat, she was not the scheming sister who had smiled at me across the kitchen table while destroying my inheritance. She was just Janine, terrified and exposed, and I saw something flicker behind her eyes that might have been regret, or might have been calculation recalibrating in real time. I didn't think he'd actually die. Think about that sentence. Think about what it means. It means she knew he was dying. She had arranged the hospice nurse, she had tracked the morphine dosage, she had sat beside him for weeks watching him fade. And still, somewhere in her mind, the plan was never about finality. It was about getting a signature that would sit in an envelope until a convenient moment, maybe years down the road. But cancer does not negotiate, and when Dad died faster than she expected, she had to use the document she had stolen, and she had to use it immediately, before I asked too many questions. Dennis did not let the moment pass. He leaned forward and asked, in that calm tone former prosecutors use right before they close the trap, "What did you think was going to happen, Miss Cole?" Janine's jaw worked, but no sound came out. Her attorney, a man who had walked in with the confidence of someone holding a signed and notarized will, suddenly looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. He put his hand on Janine's arm and said they needed a recess. Dennis said no. The video was still playing, frozen on the frame where her hand covered Dad's entirely. The pen angled unnaturally. Dennis asked if she would like to explain to the court reporter exactly what she was doing in that image. Janine's eyes went to the door, to me, to the screen, and then she said something I will never forget. I was just trying to help him sign a birthday card. For you, Marcus, he wanted to give you a card before he passed. I was helping him, because he was too weak. A birthday card. That was the story. And the blank paper she had guided his hand across was not a blank page at all, but the inside of a card. She said the notary had been for a different document entirely. Something about an insurance policy, and the will presented after his death was genuinely signed on a separate occasion. Dennis asked why, then. Had she faxed amended pages of a will from her office that same morning? She said she had been faxing her own legal documents from work. A coincidence. Dennis asked if she could produce the birthday card. She said she had thrown it away after the funeral. He asked where. She said she could not remember. Her attorney stopped the deposition 10 minutes later, but it did not matter. Everyone in that room knew. Dennis had already won. The notary was deposed the following week. Her name was Sandra, a mobile notary Janine had found through a local service. Sandra walked in looking nervous and left looking like she needed a drink. She told Dennis under oath that on October 22nd, Janine met her at the front door of Dad's house and told her he was resting but coherent. Sandra followed Janine into the den and saw my father slumped in the recliner, his head lolling sideways. Sandra said she asked him, "Do you understand that you are signing your last will and testament?" He made a sound she interpreted as yes. Janine guided his hand. Sandra stamped the page. She did not read the document aloud. She did not check his pupils. She did not ask him to state his name. When Dennis played the security footage that showed Dad mumbling, "Too tired. Can't. Too tired," Sandra put her face in her hands. She said Janine had been warm, convincing, a grieving daughter who just wanted her father's affairs in order. Sandra had no reason to doubt her. And now her notary commission was under review, and she might never stamp another document again. Janine did not go quietly once the deposition was over. Her attorney contacted local media, trying to paint me as a bitter son who had installed secret cameras to entrap his sister. But I had the text messages. I pulled up the thread from September, when I told Janine about the camera. "Great idea," she wrote back. "Make sure it covers his chair so he doesn't fall again." That single sentence, entered into the court record, neutralized her entire defense. She had known about the camera. She had forgotten it was there. The very tool I installed to protect my father had caught her in the act of stealing from him. The legal momentum shifted completely. Dennis filed an emergency injunction to freeze the $150,000, which Janine had already partially moved into a new account. The bank complied within 24 hours. Then, Dennis started tracing the money that had already been spent. What he found dug the hole so much deeper. In the 3 weeks after Dad's death, Janine had paid off her entire credit card balance, just over $14,000 of debt that had been accumulating for years. She bought a used Lexus with a cash down payment of $9,500. And she booked a 2-week vacation to Italy for the following spring, premium economy seats, non-refundable. She was spending the inheritance she had stolen before the estate had even cleared probate. The receipts painted a picture of a woman who believed she was completely untouchable. Dennis began building the criminal case by layering the medical evidence on top of the financial. He retained a forensic pharmacologist from the University of Oklahoma who reviewed the morphine logs, the hospice records, and the video. The pharmacologist wrote a report that said, in clinical language, exactly what I already knew in my chest. At 11:47 in the morning on October 22nd, Harold Cole was under a level of sedation that rendered him incapable of executing a legal document. The medication had suppressed his central nervous system to the point where even voluntary motor function was severely impaired. The pen strokes on the paper, guided entirely by Janine's hand, were not legally his. When the district attorney's office received Dennis's evidence package, they opened a felony forgery investigation within 72 hours. Janine was notified by mail, then by a visit from an investigator. She called me that night, furious, screaming that I was destroying the family, that Dad would have wanted her to have security, that I had always been the favorite even though she had done all the work during his illness. I let her talk. I let her exhaust herself. And then I said, very quietly, "Janine, I have the video. I have the fax logs. I have the morphine report. And I have Dad's own words from a recording he made years ago. A family meeting where he said the money was to be split evenly. Recording I had forgotten about until Dennis found it on Dad's voicemail from 2017. That was a bluff. There was no recording. But the silence on the other end of the line told me she believed there was. She hung up. 2 days later, she fired her attorney and hired a criminal defense lawyer. The thing about a felony charge is that it changes the air pressure in a room. Before the deposition, Janine walked through Tulsa like a woman with a clean conscience. After the Dawes letter, she stopped attending church, stopped posting on social media, stopped answering calls from our extended family. My Aunt Margaret, Dad's younger sister, called me in tears because she had heard the news from a neighbor. Cousins I had not spoken to in a decade emailed me asking if the rumors were true. When I confirmed them, the silence from some and the support from others redrew the map of my family. Some people said I should have handled it privately, that pressing charges was a betrayal of blood. But what they did not understand, and what I understood completely, was that Janine had already broken the most sacred blood trust there is, the trust of a dying father in his final hours. Dennis, meanwhile, was not finished. He started looking into the events before October. He pulled Janine's employment records, her bank statements, her phone geolocation data, and what he found made my stomach turn. In the weeks leading up to Dad's death, Janine had visited the house at times when she knew I would be at work. The camera footage from those dates, which I had not initially watched because I was focused on the signature date, showed her going through the filing cabinet in Dad's study, pulling out folders, making stacks of papers, and leaving with them. She had been searching for the original will, the one Dad had handwritten a decade earlier after Mom died, the one that split everything equally. And when she found it, she did something that would eventually add a second felony charge to her case. She burned it. The evidence came from an unlikely source. The week after the deposition, Dennis interviewed the neighbor who lived directly behind Dad's house, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Kemp. She told Dennis she had seen Janine in the backyard on the evening of October 21st, standing over the fire pit, feeding papers into the flames. She thought it was odd, but assumed it was just grief cleaning, getting rid of old documents. Janine did not know she had been seen. Dennis obtained a warrant to search the fire pit the following morning, and in the cold ash he found paper fragments that had not fully burned, fragments that, when reconstructed by a forensic document examiner, showed the words to my son, Marcus Cole, "I leave 50%. Janine had not just forged a new will, she had destroyed the original, the one that already gave me exactly half. That discovery changed the legal landscape entirely, because destruction of a will is its own crime. And the fragments were irrefutable proof that Janine had acted with clear intent to disinherit me. The day the fire pit evidence was presented to the court, Janine's new lawyer asked for a private meeting with the judge. Rumors swirled that they were discussing a plea deal, something that would keep Janine out of prison in exchange for a full confession and restitution. I did not want my sister in a cell. I wanted her to admit what she did. I wanted to hear her say, in her own voice, that I had not imagined the betrayal. But Janine was not ready to face reality. Instead of accepting a deal, she doubled down with a defense so audacious that when Dennis told me about it over coffee, I nearly choked on my drink. She was going to claim that I had manipulated the camera footage, that I had staged the entire video to frame her. She planned to put me on the stand and cross-examine me as a liar. That was where things stood when Dennis called me with one final, unbelievable update. Janine's husband, a man named Richard who had been silent throughout the entire ordeal, had walked into Dennis's office that morning carrying a shoebox. Inside the shoebox was a cassette tape, labeled in Dad's handwriting, dated 3 weeks before he died. Richard said Janine had hidden it at the back of their closet, and he had only discovered it that week while looking for something else. He did not know what was on it, but given everything else, he thought Dennis should hear it first. Dennis played it, and then he called me, voice tight, and said, "Marcus, you need to come down here. There's something on this tape that changes everything we thought we knew." It's not just about the money. I drove to Dennis's office in silence, my chest tight, because a shoebox containing a single cassette tape, labeled in my dead father's handwriting, sounded like the beginning of something I was not ready to hear. Dennis met me at the door without his usual measured smile. He led me to his conference room, where a small cassette player sat in the center of the table like a centerpiece nobody wanted to touch. Richard had already left. Dennis simply pointed to a chair and pressed play. Static, then, my father's voice. Thin and labored, the way it sounded in his final week, when every syllable was a negotiation with pain. Marcus, if you're hearing this, Janine found the papers. I don't know how long I have before she comes back. She's been. And then a loud click. A mechanical stop. The tape rolled for 3 seconds of dead air. And then, as if stepping through a door, a new voice came through the speaker. Not my father's. My sister's. This is Janine Cole. I spoke with you earlier. I need the mobile notary at my father's house by 11:30, not noon. The hospice nurse has already adjusted his medication. He'll be completely out of it, so you don't need to worry about him asking questions. Just get the signature and stamp the page. I'll handle everything else. And remember, the document says he's of sound mind. Nobody checks that. I'll make sure you're compensated. Thank you. The tape went silent. Dennis stopped the player. I stared at the speaker grill, waiting for something else to come through. Some explanation that made this not what I had just heard. But nothing came. My sister, in her own voice, had left a voicemail to the notary service, confirming the plan to obtain a signature from a sedated man incapable of consent. And she had recorded it on top of my father's final attempt to warn me. Dennis explained the technical details. Dad had kept a small dictaphone in his den for years, the kind that used microcassettes. He had recorded a message for me when he realized Janine was rifling through his files. But she discovered the tape, tried to erase it, and in her panic, accidentally recorded over it with a call she made from the landline using the same machine's memo function. She had destroyed what might have been his last words and replaced them with her own confession. The evidence was now not just visual, but auditory, and it was undeniable. This changed the legal calculus overnight. Dennis contacted the district attorney's office within the hour. The notary, already facing scrutiny, was re-interviewed with the audio transcript in hand. When she heard Janine's voice, the notary broke down completely. She admitted she had been paid $500 cash to look the other way, and that Janine had promised to refer more clients who needed documents signed discreetly. The notary agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for leniency. But the real bomb in that voicemail was the mention of the hospice nurse adjusting Dad's medication. Dennis obtained a subpoena for the hospice agency's records and phone logs. The nurse, a woman named Carla, had been the one administering morphine on October 22nd. When confronted with Janine's statement on the tape, Carla initially denied any wrongdoing. Then, Dennis played her the call. She put her face in her hands and admitted that Janine had called her that morning, frantic, saying her father was agitated and needed to be calmed down so she could handle some urgent paperwork. Janine had begged her to administer a double dose of morphine just to make him comfortable. Carla had complied without a doctor's order. The extra dose, not the standard one, had sent Dad into the near catatonic state the video captured. My sister didn't just exploit his condition, she actively deepened it. The charge of forgery was now joined by a charge of elder abuse and a felony count of conspiring to administer a controlled substance illegally. Janine's second lawyer, the high-priced defense attorney she had hired after firing her first, received the updated evidence package and apparently went pale in the conference room. Dennis later told me the lawyer requested an immediate plea negotiation. He knew that no jury would hear Janine's voice on that tape and believe anything other than what it was, a confession. But the full scope of the betrayal had not yet settled. Richard, Janine's husband, had turned in the tape, which initially made me think he was a reluctant hero. Dennis disabused me of that notion the next day. He sat me down and said that Richard had admitted something during his own deposition he knew. Not just after the fact. He knew before. Janine had told him her plan the night of October 21st. He had helped her find a cheap notary service. He had suggested the morphine request to keep Dad pliable. And he was the one who drove her to the house that morning. He only turned over the tape because, once the video surfaced, he realized Janine was going to be caught and he wanted immunity for himself. The shoebox was not an accident. It was his insurance policy, tucked away in case he needed to trade it for his own freedom. My own brother-in-law had not only stood by while Janine stole from a dying man, he had actively coached her. This revelation made the fire pit evidence even more chilling. When Janine burned the original will in Dad's backyard, Richard had been there too, shoveling ash to make sure nothing survived. The fragments Dennis recovered were enough to reconstruct a portion, but the burn site was cleaned so thoroughly that only a few scraps fluttered into the neighbor's yard. Mrs. Kemp's testimony about the fire now had a second figure in the shadows. Janine's world collapsed in a single press cycle. The local Tulsa News got wind of the case when the district attorney announced the elder abuse charge. Suddenly, Janine's face was on every screen and my phone filled with messages from people who had known us since childhood. The church, where she had volunteered for the food pantry, released a statement expressing shock. Old classmates from high school posted that they never expected this from the girl voted most likely to succeed. The online comments were brutal, and I will not repeat most of them, but the phrase morphine will trended locally for a week. Amid the chaos, I went to Dennis's office one last time before the scheduled court hearing. I asked to hear the tape again, not Janine's voice, but the 16 seconds of my father's voice that had survived the erasure. Marcus, if you're hearing this, Janine found the papers. I don't know how long I have before she comes back. She's been. The sentence never finished. But Dennis, who had sent the tape for forensic audio enhancement, said the lab detected faint words beneath the static that followed. My father had been trying to say, "She's been watching me." That was all. He knew Janine was monitoring him, waiting for a moment of weakness. He had tried to tell me, and she had silenced him. Not with malice, but with a clumsy finger on a record button, erasing the warning that might have saved his estate. The court hearing was set for the following week. Janine was to appear and formally answer the charges. I showed up early, sat in the front row with my wife, and watched the courtroom fill. Janine's chair remained empty. The judge waited 20 minutes. Janine's lawyer, clearly flustered, said he had been unable to reach his client since the previous evening. The judge issued a bench warrant immediately. Janine Cole, the woman who had taken a dying man's hand and guided it for profit, had fled. Her husband Richard had already surrendered his passport as part of his immunity deal. But Janine's was missing, and her car was found abandoned at a bus station in Oklahoma City 3 days later. I stood in that courtroom feeling a strange mixture of vindication and grief. The $150,000 was still frozen, but now it was not about the money. It was about a cassette tape in a shoebox, a voice that got interrupted, and a sister who had not just stolen an inheritance, but had erased a father's final attempt to speak to his son. And somewhere out there, Janine was running, carrying the full knowledge that her own voice had convicted her. The manhunt lasted 11 days. Janine was found in a budget motel outside Wichita, Kansas, checked in under the name Helen Marsh, a name I didn't recognize until Dennis reminded me that Marsh was the maiden name of our mother. She was paying in cash and had dyed her hair a flat, unremarkable brown. When marshals knocked on the door, she answered calmly, as if she'd been expecting them, and asked if she could finish her coffee first. They let her. The dashcam footage from the patrol car later showed her sitting in the back seat, staring out the window, completely silent. The officer who transported her said she never spoke once during the 4-hour drive back to Tulsa. She was booked into the Tulsa County Jail on a Tuesday afternoon, charged with forgery in the first degree, elder abuse, conspiracy to obtain a controlled substance by deception, and flight to avoid prosecution. The combined potential sentence was 22 years. Richard, true to his nature, had already finalized his immunity deal by the time they brought her in. He testified against her in a preliminary hearing, voice shaking, detailing the entire plan from the night she had first asked, "What if Dad changes his will?" He described how she had practiced a forgery of Dad's signature on scrap paper for 2 weeks, how she timed the hospice visits, how she called the notary while sitting in the parking lot of the agency with the engine running. The courtroom was silent. Janine watched him speak with a look I cannot fully describe, except to say it was the expression of a woman watching someone she once trusted methodically demolish the last wall around her life. The plea deal came 3 days before trial. Janine agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence that still required incarceration. The judge accepted the deal, but made a point of reading aloud from the victim impact statement I had submitted. The judge said, and I will never forget this, "What you did to your father in his final hours was not just criminal. It was profane. You took a sacred trust and you exploited it for $14,000 in credit card debt and a used Lexus." Janine stood with her hands cuffed in front of her, staring at the floor, and when the judge asked if she had anything to say, she repeated the same 4 words she had spoken at the deposition, "I didn't think he'd actually die." This time, the words landed differently, not as a shocking confession, but as the final, hollow rationalization of someone who had convinced herself that her greed was not greed because she believed she would never have to face the full consequence. She was sentenced to 4 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 2. The sentence felt lenient to some and crushing to others. My Aunt Margaret told me afterward that she wished Janine had gotten longer, but I felt only a strange, leaden stillness. My sister, the golden child, was going to prison, and the money she had stolen, the $150,000 she had tried to erase me from, was ordered released by the court. The bank unfroze the account, and after legal fees and the restitution garnishment that repaid the funds she had already spent, the remaining sum came to just over $130,000. Split evenly, as Dad always intended. $65,000 each. That figure, so precise, so ordinary, felt like the most profound number I had ever seen. The day the transfer cleared, I drove to the cemetery. I stood in front of my father's headstone with no flowers, no speech, just my hands in my jacket pockets. I told him, quietly, that it was done, that Janine had been held accountable, that his money had come to me not as a windfall, but as the final, unbroken promise of a man who had spent 47 years in work boots, saving for a fairness he believed in more than anything else. I didn't cry. I'd done my crying in Dennis's conference room, watching my sister's hand move my father's hand across a blank page. This was something calmer. Something I can only describe as the quiet that comes after a long fever breaks. In the weeks that followed, the surprising details kept emerging. the way they do when a dam breaks and the water reveals everything that had been hidden underneath. The first surprise came from the notary, Sandra. As part of her cooperation agreement, she provided the district attorney with a list of other clients she had serviced under similar irregular circumstances. That list led to the unraveling of a small but active network of mobile notaries who were willing, for a fee, to notarize documents without verifying capacity or even presence. 2 additional elderly victims were identified, and charges were filed in those cases as well. Janine's crime had been part of a pattern she never knew existed, and the evidence from our case became the cornerstone of a wider prosecution. Dennis told me this over lunch one afternoon, and we both sat with the strange irony. My sister's greed had, in a grim way, protected people she had never met. The second surprise arrived in a padded envelope with no return address. Inside was a letter from Janine, written on prison stationery, the handwriting neat and controlled. She did not apologize. She did not ask for forgiveness. She wrote that she had spent the first month of her incarceration replaying the video in her mind. The same video she had tried to claim was staged. And she had finally accepted that the woman in that footage guiding Dad's hand was not someone she recognized. She wrote, "I became a person I didn't know I could become, and I don't know how to undo that." I read the letter 3 times, then folded it back into the envelope and placed it in a drawer. I didn't respond. Some things cannot be undone with words, and I was not going to pretend they could. But the third surprise, the one that I had not seen coming at all, came from my father's house, weeks after Janine was sentenced, when I finally went to clean out the den. Dennis had already removed the evidence, but the room was still heavy with Dad's absence. His recliner, the same one in the video, sat in the corner like a monument to everything that had happened. I began sorting through the filing cabinet that Janine had ransacked, finding mostly old tax returns and warranty cards. And then, at the very back of the bottom drawer, wedged behind a false panel I had never noticed before, I found a small fireproof box. The box was locked. The key was taped to the underside of the drawer with masking tape, exactly where Dad had taught me to hide spare keys when I was a child. Inside the box was a stack of papers. The original will, the one Janine believed she had burned completely, was not the only copy. My father, who never trusted a single point of failure, had made a duplicate years earlier and hidden it in this box, along with a handwritten letter addressed to both of us. The letter was dated the day after his diagnosis, when he first learned the cancer was terminal. It was short, and I can quote it from memory to Marcus and Janine. "I am writing this because someday you may not agree on things, and I want the last word from me to be clear. I love you both equally. I have watched you grow into different people, with different struggles, but you are both my children, and my heart is divided perfectly in half. Whatever I leave behind, share it. Not because the law says so, but because I am asking you to. If you cannot share it, then the one who refuses has already lost the part of me that mattered most. Love, Dad." I sat on the floor of that den for a long time, holding the letter. The legal case was already over. The money had already been split. The court had done what my father had asked, not because of this letter, but because the evidence forced it. And yet, here was the final, quiet surprise. Dad had known. He had known Janine might try something, not because he distrusted her, but because he understood that grief and money can turn people into versions of themselves they don't yet recognize. He had prepared a message that would survive even if she destroyed the document. And the only copy that survived was the one she never found. I don't read the letter often. It sits in that same fireproof box, now on a shelf in my own home, beside a cassette tape that holds both my father's interrupted warning and my sister's accidental confession. The two recordings, layered over each other, form a strange accidental duet of a family's last chapter. I listen to it sometimes, not to relive the pain, but to remind myself that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing. It surfaced in a security camera I installed to catch falls. It surfaced in a fax log from an office printer. It surfaced in a voicemail recorded over a dying man's last words. And it surfaced, finally and quietly, in a letter that my father wrote in case we forgot who we were to him. The $65,000 I received did not change my life dramatically. I put a portion into savings, used some to repair the foundation of my own house, and set aside a smaller fund I call the Harold Cole Family Grant. A modest amount I use to help friends and neighbors who are navigating probate disputes they can't afford to fight. It's not a foundation. It's just a few $1,000s a year given quietly, with a note that says, "This is from a father who believed in fairness." Every time I send one, I think of Dad in his work pants with patched knees, saving $1 at a time so that his children might someday share something he never had. Security. I often think about the word security. For my dad, security meant a number on a bank statement, a figure that could be divided equally and handed down with a smile. For Janine, security meant having it all, because to her, fairness felt like loss. And for me, security has come to mean something entirely different. It means knowing that a camera I installed to catch a physical fall caught a moral one instead. The strange thing about betrayal is that it doesn't just take something from you. It also gives you something. A clarity you didn't ask for. I now see family gatherings with different eyes. I hear stories about wills and estates with an ear tuned to the silences, the pauses when someone says, "But that's what Dad wanted," and everyone at the table looks down. Those silences are where the truth lives. I spent months wondering how many families sit in those same silences, never finding the video, never discovering the voicemail, never opening a fireproof box hidden behind a false panel in a drawer. The answer, based on what Dennis tells me, is more than any of us want to believe. The probate courts see it every day. Documents that appeared overnight, signatures that look a little too steady from a hand that was trembling the day before. Notaries who were paid in cash and hope. Most families don't have a security camera running. Most families don't have a brother too stubborn to let the silence win. I got lucky, if you can call it that. I got a father who prepared a message for me and a sister who accidentally recorded her own voice confessing. That combination, the deliberate message and the accidental proof, is the only reason I am standing on the other side of this story instead of buried beneath it. There's a question I get asked anytime I tell this story, and it's always the same. Would you do it again? Would you press charges against your own sister if you had the chance to go back? The honest answer is that I didn't press charges. The district attorney did, based on evidence that was undeniable. But if the question is whether I would hide that evidence to keep my sister out of prison, the answer is no. Because covering up what she did to Dad would mean I had learned nothing from him. It would mean I was willing to erase his last real act. Not the signature she forged, but the letter he wrote. The quiet insistence that fairness is not just a legal concept, but a love language. He said if we couldn't share what he left behind, the one who refused would have already lost the part of him that mattered most. Janine lost that part. I didn't. If you've made it this far, you understand these stories don't come from nowhere. They happen to real people in real kitchens in Tulsa and everywhere else. If this one moved you, do us a favor and hit that like button. And if you want more true stories about family, betrayal, and the things that get uncovered after the funeral, subscribe. It costs you nothing and helps us tell the next one. And if you're in the middle of your own version of this right now, if a document showed up that doesn't feel right, if a sibling you trusted suddenly has answers for everything, look closer. Look behind the drawer. Look in the fire pit. Look at the security footage you forgot was running. Because sometimes the truth is already waiting. It just needs someone to stop accepting the silence.